On September 8, 1995, in a small, unassuming apartment in Los Angeles, 75-year-old Eileen Chang quietly passed away. When she was finally discovered, she had been gone for a week. Beside her bed was a tote bag containing all the essential documents of her life, neatly arranged. This woman, who had once shaken the literary world to its core, why did she choose such a solitary farewell? Welcome to Fanko Decodes. I'm Fanko, your friend and guide in decoding the wisdom of legendary figures. Today, through three pivotal moments in her life, I want to take you deep into the inner world of Eileen Chang, a literary titan you may have never heard of, but whose wisdom rivals that of Stoics like Marcus Aurelius or existentialists like Simone de Beauvoir. We're going to uncover the profound truths she saw, truths that allowed her to live a life of such absolute, uncompromising resolve. Many who know Eileen Chang, even in passing, associate her with classic quotes often attributed to her, like, "Because I understand, I can be compassionate." Or another famous line, "Life, if it were only like the first time we met," which captures a beautiful, fleeting nostalgia. To be precise, that latter line actually comes from the Qing dynasty poet Nalan Xingda. But its sentiment, that sigh for a perfect moment, set against the bleak backdrop of an impermanent life, perfectly aligns with the world Eileen Chang painted with her words. But the real Eileen Chang was far more complex and profound than these gentle phrases suggest. She created her masterpieces before she turned 30, and then, for the next 45 years, chose a life of near total seclusion. She loved a man, Hu Lansheng, who was branded one of the most notorious traitors in modern Chinese history, and she rejected all the grand, sweeping ideologies of her time. What's truly stunning is that she used her 75 years to conduct a life experiment, a masterclass in a unique way of living. She refused to be chained to the past, refused to pander to the future, and refused to be held hostage by the trends of the present. This way of living holds powerful lessons for us today, especially now, in an age where everything and everyone is expected to be correct, to fit into neat boxes. Eileen Chang's life philosophy might force you to rethink what true freedom really means. So, let's journey to our first moment, a 17-year-old's escape and the death of an ideal in Hong Kong. Part 1. The Escape from a Gilded Cage, the Phantom of Hong Kong. Summer, 1937. Shanghai. As the plane trees cast their deep green shade, furious shouts erupted from the Grand Zhang mansion. 17-year-old Zhang Ying, she hadn't yet taken the name Eileen Chang, stood at the top of the stairs, watching her stepmother's hand swing towards her face. For the first time, she chose to fight back. "You dare hit me?" she cried, blocking the slap. That single act of defiance sealed her fate. Her stepmother immediately ran upstairs to her father Zhang Ziyi, who was lost in the haze of his opium pipe, a relic of a fallen dynasty, a symbol of the decay of an aristocratic China that had been broken by Western imperialism a century before. "Zhang Ying tried to hit me," she wailed. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled room, a flicker of rage ignited in her father's eyes. He stumbled down the stairs and unleashed a savage beating on his own daughter. Each blow was a brutal message. In this house, you are nothing. If it weren't for an old family servant who threw herself in the way, begging for mercy, Eileen might have been killed that day. For the next 6 months, she was a prisoner in her own home, confined to a single room, guarded by 2 servants, forbidden to step outside. She contracted dysentery, her fever raged, but her father refused to call a doctor. Yet, in that half-year of captivity, she didn't despair. Instead, she secretly exercised, building her strength, meticulously planning her escape. On a cold winter night in 1937, while the guards dozed off, Eileen silently pushed open her door. She took nothing with, she wore only a thin cheongsam, and vanished into the biting Shanghai wind. That night, she shed the identity of young Miss of the Zhang family forever, and with it, she shed every last illusion she had about family. This escape was Eileen Chang's first great awakening. She learned a brutal truth. The so-called glory of a family name, the supposed bonds of blood, were utterly meaningless in the face of cold, hard reality. She sought refuge with her mother, Huang Suchong, thinking she had finally found freedom. But she quickly discovered her mother was no safe harbor. Her mother was a new woman of the era, a modern, independent figure who had returned from France, chasing a Western ideal of liberation. But this independence came at a cost, a cool emotional detachment, even from her own daughter. One day, Eileen, beaming with pride, brought home the money she had earned from her writing, eager to prove her worth. Her mother barely glanced at it, simply placing the cash on a table. A few days later, Eileen heard that her mother had taken that money to a mahjong game and lost every last penny. In that moment, a profound chill settled in Eileen's heart. Her father represented a decaying, corrupt past. Her mother represented a hollow, illusory future. And she was trapped between them, with nothing and no one to lean on. Let's pause here and decode what this means. This experience forged the bedrock of her philosophy. In this world, you can rely on no one, not even those closest to you. The grand ideas, family honor, female emancipation were just hollow words. The only person who could save her was herself. This escape at 17 wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual declaration of independence. From that moment on, Eileen Chang began her solitary journey, never following the past, never pandering to the future, living only in the raw, unfiltered present. But destiny had far more severe tests in store for her. Autumn 1939. The campus of Hong Kong University, then a British colonial outpost. 19-year-old Eileen Chang walked along the stone paths as leaves fell around her. In her hand was a letter from her mother in Shanghai. It was brief and transactional. "Yang, I have set aside a sum of money for you. You can use it to buy a few new outfits, or you can use it to pay for your education. The choice is yours. Once the money is spent, our account is settled. You will walk your own path from now on." Eileen read the letter and gave a bitter smile. Even the final thread of maternal connection was being severed with the cold logic of a business deal. She chose education and came to Hong Kong. Here, she met a man who would shatter the last of her youthful idealism, her history professor, a man named Franz. Franz was the quintessential English gentleman, erudite, elegant, and brimming with idealistic fervor. He admired Eileen's talent and often discussed literature and history with her after class. For the first time, she experienced a pure intellectual mentorship, untainted by personal gain. In her mind, Franz embodied a noble spiritual quality. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War erupted. Days later, the Japanese began their assault on Hong Kong. Air raid sirens wailed across campus. Students scattered. Eileen stood at her dorm window, watching the distant flashes of artillery, a strange sense of excitement rising within her. She remembered what Franz had said in class. At the critical moments of history, every person must make a choice. That choice defines who you are. Soon, the war arrived at their doorstep. Eileen saw Professor Franz in a military uniform, ready to fight for the British Empire. "Jeanne," he told her as he departed, his eyes shining with that idealistic light, "I must go and fulfill my duty as an English gentleman." Eileen watched his retreating figure, her heart filled with reverence. She believed he would prove himself a hero on the battlefield, returning in glory or dying a martyr's death. But reality delivered a stunning, vicious blow. A month later, news came. Franz was dead. But he hadn't died in a heroic battle against the Japanese. He had died during a routine patrol after getting into an argument with one of his own sentries and was shot and killed by friendly fire. Eileen was in the university library when she heard the news. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Everything was so calm, but her inner world had been struck by lightning. The teacher she respected most, the man who represented idealism and heroism, had died in such a farcical, meaningless way. The absurdity didn't end there. One of her classmates, inspired by Franz, had also joined the army to serve the nation. He returned a few weeks later, and his words extinguished the last embers of her faith. "Eileen, do you know what I did in the army?" he asked, his eyes burning with anger and disillusionment. "They made us carry stretchers. We had to carry wounded British soldiers from the front lines. These men were dying anyway, so why did we have to risk our lives to save them? Are our Chinese lives worth less than theirs?" He continued, his voice shaking. "And all the benefits and pay they promised us? We never saw a cent. We were just cannon fodder, second-class citizens." Listening to him, Eileen felt a bone-deep chill. This was her second great disillusionment. She now understood that so-called idealism and heroism were fragile illusions easily shattered by reality. Franz's death wasn't tragic, it was absurd. Her classmates' patriotism wasn't noble, it was a product of deception. Even her last spiritual anchor had crumbled into dust. That night, Eileen sat alone in her dorm room, gazing at the sky lit up by the fires of war. She thought of her father's decay, her mother's coldness, and Franz's ridiculous death. A single thought crystallized in her mind: there is nothing in this world worthy of your absolute faith. Not family, not ideals, not so-called righteous causes. From that day forward, Eileen Chang became immune to all grand, abstract words. Nation, people, ideology, to her they were just hollow concepts. She would later write in one of her essays, "Our attitude towards the war could be compared to someone dozing off on a hard wooden bench. It's uncomfortable, and we complain endlessly, but eventually we fall asleep. Whatever we can ignore, we ignore." This seemingly callous attitude was, in fact, a form of profound clarity. She had seen through the hypocrisy of idealism and the absurdity of heroism. She chose a more authentic way to live. But she had no idea that fate was preparing one final brutal lesson for her, a lesson about love. After the fall of Hong Kong, Eileen dropped out of university and returned to Shanghai. She thought she had seen through everything, that she could now live out her days in quiet observation. She was wrong. In Shanghai, she met Eileen Chang, the man who would nearly make her abandon all reason. This relationship would become the final and most painful awakening of her life. And that brings us to our second pivotal moment, the final farewell to love. Part 2, the final farewell to love. Spring, 1944. Shanghai. The city was an isolated island under Japanese occupation, a glittering facade of glamour masking a deep, pervasive rot. Eileen Chang was in the office of a literary journal, holding a freshly written manuscript, a short story called Sealed Off. It was about a fleeting romance between two strangers on a tram, stuck during an air raid siren. "Miss Chang, a gentleman is here to see you," the editor announced. The man who walked in was in his late 30s, well-dressed, with deep, penetrating eyes. His name was Eileen Chang, and he was the Vice Minister of Propaganda for the Japanese-backed collaborationist government of Wang Jingwei. In other words, he held a title branded with the most toxic label in modern China, Hanjian, a traitor to his own people, a collaborator akin to a Quisling in Nazi-occupied Norway. Logically, she should have despised him, or at least kept her distance. "Miss Chang, I read your story Sealed Off, and I was deeply shaken," Eileen Chang began, his voice gentle. "The sense of absurdity you captured, that search for something real within the absurd, it spoke directly to my heart." Eileen looked up, studying him. His words had disarmed her. This man, this collaborator, seemed to genuinely understand what she was trying to express. "You find it absurd?" she asked. "Profoundly absurd," he replied with a wry smile. My entire life is an absurdity. I want China to be strong, yet I fear it becoming too strong. I want the Japanese to trust me, yet I know they never truly will. I live inside a permanent paradox. His candor was astonishing. She had met countless posturing, hypocritical men, but Hu Lancheng seemed to have torn off all his masks in her presence. In the months that followed, they met frequently. He was 14 years her senior, filling a void of fatherly affection she had craved since childhood. More importantly, he seemed to be the one person on earth who truly understood her inner world. In August 1944, Eileen wrote him a note that would become famous. When she saw him, she became very low into the dust. But her heart was full of joy, and from the dust, a flower blossomed. That summer, Eileen Chang completely surrendered. It was the first and last time in her life that she would set aside all her rational defenses for the sake of love. She even wrote the novel Love in a Fallen City for him, which contains this telling passage: "The fall of Hong Kong had made her dreams come true. But in this incomprehensible world, who can say what is the cause and what is the affect? Who knows? Perhaps it was to fulfill her destiny that an entire city had to fall." Let's decode this. For Eileen, the small personal story was always more real, more meaningful than the grand sweep of history. A single love affair was more eternal than a world war. But reality soon came crashing down. Though Hu Lancheng loved Eileen, he was pathologically unfaithful. Soon after their marriage, he began affairs, first with a young nurse, then a woman named Fanko, and others after that. Each time he was discovered, Hu would use his intellect and eloquence to defend himself. He'd insist that these other women meant nothing, that Eileen was his one true love. He'd even quote classical texts, talking about how love's origins are unknown, yet it runs deep, reframing his infidelity as a kind of poetic, multifaceted passion. Time and again, Eileen forgave him. She refused to admit she had made a mistake. She chose to believe his philandering was a symptom of his own inner torment and loneliness. But in August 1945, Japan surrendered, and everything changed. As a high-profile collaborator, Hu Lancheng became a fugitive. Eileen faced an agonizing choice: follow him into a life on the run, or break with him forever. To follow him meant being branded the wife of a traitor, living a life of destitution and fear. But what tormented her more was the knowledge that even if she sacrificed everything for him, he would never be faithful. On the run, he would surely find other women, and the cycle of betrayal would continue. In the summer of 1947, Eileen Chang made her decision. On a sweltering afternoon, she sat at her desk and wrote him a letter. "Lancheng, I no longer love you. You stopped loving me long ago. This decision I have made after 1.5 years of long consideration. Do not come looking for me. Even if you write, I will not read it." With the letter, she enclosed 300,000 yuan, the entire earnings from her 2 most recent screenplays. This gesture was pure Eileen Chang, filled with complex, contradictory emotions. It was a final, contradictory act of love and severance. It was a payoff, a clean break, but also a gesture of concern for his survival. It was her way of saying, "I am done with you, but I will not see you starve." It was love and dignity intertwined. When Hu received the letter, he rushed from his hiding place to Shanghai. He knelt outside her apartment door for an entire night, but Eileen never opened it. The next morning, a neighbor found him still kneeling and urged him to leave. With red, swollen eyes, Hu said, "I know she's in there. I know she can hear me, but she will never open the door again." In 1950, at the age of 30, Eileen Chang formally divorced him. The end of this relationship marked a crucial turning point. She had shed her last illusion about love, and with it, her last expectation of human nature. In that final, merciless letter, Eileen was saying goodbye to her past self. Goodbye to the girl who believed love could conquer all. Goodbye to the woman who was willing to compromise her dignity for a connection. From this point on, she truly became an observer, watching the absurdities and sorrows of the human condition with a cool, dispassionate eye. She would later write in her novel Half a Lifelong Romance. For people over 30, 10 or 8 years pass in the blink of an eye. But for the young, 3 or 5 years can be a lifetime. This wasn't just a line about her character Monzian. It was a prophecy for her own life after 30. At 30, Eileen Chang had experienced the decay of family, the death of idealism, and the betrayal of love. She had finally understood the fundamental truth of life. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is completely trustworthy. Nothing is unchanging. But this awakening did not make her cynical or bitter. Instead, it gave her a transcendent wisdom. This is the genius of Eileen Chang. She saw the void at the center of human existence, but still chose to write about it with a tender, empathetic hand. When love, this final grand illusion, also shattered, there was nothing left in her world to project her emotions onto. Carrying a heart that had been thoroughly tempered by reality, she turned towards a wider, more absolute solitude, America. But she would soon discover that what awaited her across the ocean was just another kind of gilded cage. And this brings us to our final moment, the Hermitage in America. Part 3, The American Hermitage. Autumn, 1955. A small apartment in Los Angeles. A 35-year-old Eileen Chang sat at a simple desk. Outside, the perpetual California sun was shining, but her mood was bleak. On her desk lay several rejected manuscripts, novels she had written in English. The editor's reasons were all variations on a theme. Your stories are too dark, too pessimistic. American readers don't like this style. Dear Miss Chang, the latest rejection letter read, your prose is exquisite, but American readers prefer stories with a sense of hope. Could you perhaps write something more uplifting? Eileen looked at the letter and gave another of her bitter smiles. Uplifting? She no longer knew what that word meant. She had been in America for 2 years and felt like a fish out of water. In Shanghai, she was a literary goddess. Her books flew off the shelves. In America, she was just another immigrant, an Oriental woman who couldn't speak perfectly idiomatic English. What pained her more was the need to pander to American tastes just to survive. She tried writing chinoiserie, stories filled with the mysterious, exotic Orient that Americans imagined. But every time she put pen to paper, she felt a wave of profound self-disgust. This was not what she wanted to write. Sometimes, she would think back to her days in Shanghai. Even though the city was occupied, even though she was in love with a traitor, at least she could use her own language to tell the stories she needed to tell. Now, she had to use someone else's language to tell stories someone else wanted to hear. It felt like being forced to wear ill-fitting clothes. By 1958, Eileen was 38. Her second marriage was also failing. Her husband, Ferdinand Rayer, was an American writer 29 years her senior. At first, she thought she had found a spiritual companion, but she soon realized Rayer was more of a burden. He was in poor health and had suffered a series of strokes, requiring her constant care. Worse, their communication was often strained, preventing any deep connection. Eileen found she was, once again, living with a stranger. When they separated, Rayer told her, Eileen, you're a good woman, but you are too lonely. You lock yourself in a world no one else can enter. She didn't argue. She knew he was right. In a way, she was lonely. But her loneliness was not a condition forced upon her. It was a deliberate choice. She had tried relying on others, and it had always ended in disappointment. She had tried believing in love, and it had ended in betrayal. She had tried to conform to society, and it had ended in self-distortion. So now she chose a new way of life, radical, absolute independence. Starting in the 1960s, Eileen Chang virtually disappeared from public life. But this wasn't a sad, lonely decline. It was a deliberate, radical act of curation. She moved into a series of sparse, anonymous apartments in Los Angeles and began living as a recluse. This extreme independence, however, wasn't some mythic, effortless transcendence. In her letters to friends, we see her meticulously tracking her royalties, her commentary on world affairs still bitingly sharp. She wasn't an ascetic saint floating above the world. She was a mortal who had seen human nature too clearly and chose to use physical distance to protect her inner order. Her daily routine was meticulously simple. She slept during the day and wrote at night, intentionally desynchronizing her schedule from the rest of the world to avoid social contact. She rarely left her apartment, ordering necessities by mail. She hardly ever answered the phone, believing most conversations were meaningless noise. In an age before social media, she was practicing the ultimate form of unfollowing. She wasn't just disconnecting, she was curating her own reality. This seemingly negative existence, however, brought her an unprecedented sense of inner peace. Free from the turmoil of relationships, free from the pressure of social expectations, free from the highs and lows of love, she could finally live completely on her own terms. And in this state, she began to write her most authentic work. Works like Little Reunions, her final, unflinching look back at her relationship with Eileen Chang. These works pandered to no one. They were pure, unvarnished expressions of her inner truth. In 1976, at 56, she completed the novella Lust, Caution. This story of a female spy who falls for her assassination target is considered by many to be her late career masterpiece. But Eileen knew she wasn't writing a spy thriller. She was writing about the complexity of human nature and the absurdity of love. The protagonist, Wang Jiazi, falls for the very man she is meant to destroy, a love that is both devastatingly real and utterly preposterous. Just like her own love for Eileen Chang. By the 1980s, American academics like the great scholar C.T. Sia began to champion her work. They discovered that this reclusive Chinese writer was a literary genius of the highest order who had been criminally overlooked. But Eileen was indifferent to the praise. She was long past the age of needing external validation. In 1990, at the age of 70, she made a final, crucial decision. She would prepare for her own death. This might sound morbid, but for Eileen, it was the ultimate rational choice. She did not want to fade away in a hospital hooked up to machines. She would manage her final exit while she was still in control. She wrote a will, leaving her estate to her trusted friends. She organized her manuscripts, making final edits and revisions. She even laid out detailed instructions for her own death: cremation, no funeral, no ceremony of any kind. On September 1st, 1995, a 75-year-old Eileen Chang felt her body begin to fail. She knew her time was short. She placed her important documents in a tote bag and hung it on the inside of her front door, where it would be the first thing anyone entering would see. Then, she lay down on a simple mat on the floor and quietly waited for the end. A week later, her landlord found her. When the police arrived, they found her looking peaceful, almost serene. Her small apartment was immaculate. There were no signs of chaos or struggle. She had orchestrated her own final scene with the same precision she brought to her prose. No drama, no burden, no mess. It was the ultimate expression of her life's philosophy, absolute, uncompromising independence right to the very end. Eileen Chang's life, from the 17-year-old escapee to the 75-year-old who died with quiet dignity, is defined by a single, powerful theme: independence. She was independent from the expectations of her family, independent from the currents of her era, independent from the bonds of love, and ultimately independent from the fear of death itself. This independence wasn't coldness, it was a form of profound wisdom. She saw through the illusions of life and chose to live in the most authentic way she could. On the surface, her last 40 years might look like a failure. No epic romance, no new blockbuster literary achievements, no widespread public acclaim. But from another perspective, she was a supreme success. She lived a life that was truly her own, never held hostage by any external force, never compromising for anyone. This, perhaps, is the most precious legacy Eileen Chang leaves us. In a world saturated with noise, how to maintain your inner silence. In a society drowning in expectations, how to hold fast to your own choices. She proved with her life that true freedom isn't about having the right to choose. It's about having the power to not be held captive by your choices. Shift in music, becoming more reflective and direct. Fanko Decodes the three awakenings for our time. So, after hearing her story, you might be asking, what does her life mean for us today? I believe that through her 75 years, Eileen Chang demonstrated 3 levels of awakening, 3 layers of disillusionment that are more relevant now than ever. Awakening Level 1, seeing through the illusion of dependence. So much of our modern suffering comes from our reliance on external things. We depend on our family's approval, our partner's fidelity, society's validation, the likes and follows on social media. But Eileen's life is a stark reminder. These dependencies are almost always fragile. Parents can disappoint you. Lovers can betray you. Society can abandon you. Ideals can crumble. While we are still agonizing over these disappointments, Eileen had already moved to a deeper level. If everything is unreliable, why not learn to rely on yourself? This doesn't mean becoming cold or unfeeling. It means becoming radically self-sufficient. When you no longer need anyone, everything they give you becomes a gift, not a requirement. Awakening Level 2, seeing through the tyranny of values. We live in an age of standard answers. We are told what success looks like, what happiness is, what the right way to live is. Get the degree, get the job, get the house, get married. But Eileen Chang's life screams a different message. These standard answers were written by someone else, and they may not be right for you. In her time, the standard answers were follow tradition and be a good wife, or follow the revolution and serve the collective. Eileen chose a third path, follow no predetermined standard, only the voice of your own inner truth. This choice made her an outsider then, and it takes just as much courage today, because to live off script means to endure more loneliness and misunderstanding. But it also means experiencing a much greater freedom, the freedom to define your own success, to choose your own form of happiness, to author your own life. Awakening Level 3, seeing through the nature of life and death. The highest level of awakening is a transcendence of life and death itself. Most people fear death, so they desperately try to grasp at things in their limited time: wealth, fame, love, meaning. But in her later years, Eileen reached a state of profound detachment. She was no longer trying to grasp anything. She was learning to let go of everything. She let go of the pursuit of worldly success. She let go of the craving for approval. And she even let go of her attachment to life itself. This letting go is not passive. It's an active, powerful stance. When you are no longer chained to these external things, you gain true freedom. Eileen Chang's final years of solitude were not an escape. They were the highest form of spiritual practice. She was training herself to live purely in the present, to not be hijacked by the past or the future, and to find the deepest satisfaction in the simplest existence. In our hyper-connected, hyper-competitive world today, her philosophy is more vital than ever. We are bombarded by information, held hostage by expectations, and paralyzed by infinite choices. We live with a constant fear of missing out, of falling behind, of not being successful enough. But Eileen Chang tells us, perhaps what we need is not more, but less. Not more success, but more clarity about what we truly want. Not more connections, but a deeper capacity for solitude. Not more options, but a firmer standard for our choices. She proved with her entire being that it is possible to follow no trend, to pander to no expectation, and to live only according to your own inner compass. That life may be solitary, but it will be free. It may be simple, but it will be profound. So, what does it mean to live like Eileen Chang today? It's not about imitating her reclusive lifestyle. It's about absorbing her spiritual core. In an age that demands more, learn to be content with less. In a society that worships success, define your own metrics for a life well lived. In a culture that fears loneliness, learn to cherish your own company. And in a world that chases permanence, learn to accept the beauty of impermanence. This is not about escaping reality. It's about engaging with reality on a deeper, more authentic level. When you are no longer a hostage to external standards, you can finally live more truthfully, love more profoundly, and choose more freely. Eileen Chang once wrote, "Life is a gorgeous robe, crawling with lice." She saw the lice, the ugliness, the absurdity, the pain, but she never lost her appreciation for the gorgeousness of the robe. And that is her most precious gift to us, to see through the absurdity of life, yet maintain a compassion for it. To be neither deceived by illusion nor defeated by despair. When you begin to understand the complexity and impermanence of life, you begin to acquire true wisdom. And when you begin to accept that complexity and impermanence, you begin to experience true freedom. May you, like Eileen Chang, find your own silence in this noisy world and your own calm in this anxious age, not because you are escaping, but because you see things clearly, not because you are cold, but because you understand. I'm Fanko, and this has been Fanko Decodes. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. If this story has helped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Your interaction is the fuel that keeps this journey going. I'll see you next time.